With that, would love to welcome you all, this beautiful crowd, to our riveting topic tonight, crime and consequence. As we're going to learn shortly, this is far more relevant to our lives than we choose to admit or than we might realize. There are as many people incarcerated in American jails as the entire population of the state of Kansas. We are spending $80 billion a year, more than $80 billion a year, on keeping our prisons functional. Can you imagine how many walls they could build with all of that? It's incredible. More prisoners than in the history of the United States of America. And tonight's discussion, the first of our Crime and Consequence series, the 6-session series, is going to talk about this very touching topic, which is really the point of prison. What's the point of prison, as discussed in both American law as well as from Jewish, Talmudic, and spiritual, Kabbalistic perspective? Thrilled to have this wonderful crowd here tonight. Lots of amazing material to cover. My name is Rabbi Dovid Vigler. I'm the rabbi here at the Chabad Palm Beach Gardens, and I'm thrilled to welcome each and every one of you on this very courageous journey on what should give you a very solid understanding, a very solid context and background on the Jewish view on prison and incarceration tonight, and indeed on the whole very hot and trending topic, which is criminal justice reform. As we begin, we're all hearing about criminal justice reform and prison reform, which seems to indicate that we need to fix something that's broken. But what exactly is it that's broken? What is the problem that we need to fix? Let's introduce this with a brief video presentation.
In January 1996, Anthony Rolong, a 17-year-old Massachusetts drug dealer, fatally stabbed 20-year-old Bobby Bothello in a violent street fight. Justice was swift and clear. Anthony was locked away for life in a maximum security facility. Many convicts are given the opportunity for parole at some point, where a panel of officials interviews inmates and weighs their case individually, considering factors such as good behavior in jail, the results of psychological testing, and the likelihood of a crime-free life after release. If the panel grants parole, inmates are released from jail early. Nevertheless, their original sentences have not been canceled, and they must abide by strict sets of conditions. If they are caught breaking the law or their parole agreement, they are immediately reincarcerated for the remainder of their original sentence. But not Anthony. He was sentenced to life without parole due to the horrific nature of his crime. Anthony was told that he would be staring at the same bland bars forever. 18 long years crept by. His lucky break came from an unexpected source.
The court ruled today that juveniles can't be given mandatory life sentences without parole. They say that's cruel and unusual punishment.
The court explained that it had been proven scientifically that juvenile brains have not fully developed, so the possibility exists for radical change in thought and behavior. In other words, a teen sentenced for life without parole because he was deemed irreparable may in fact be re-educated to become a safe, remorseful, law-abiding, and productive member of society. The court insisted that offenders in such cases must be given the opportunity to apply for parole. If the reviewing panel agrees that parole is warranted, it can then be applied. The Supreme Court ruling provoked an outcry.
Families of victims of teenage killers are trying to convince lawmakers to keep juvenile murderers behind bars.
Today, they delivered a petition with 15,000 signatures to the governor in their fight to keep the murderers behind bars.
Almost all the victims' families were stunned about the decision. The questions were, how could this have happened? Do we have to see these murderers again? Will I be in the same room with them? My parents won't be able to handle this. I thought he was away forever. And those are, how do you answer those questions?
Anthony Rollon was convicted of murder and sentenced to life without the chance.
Anthony's parole hearing was a highly emotional affair.
After being convicted of taking Mr. Patello's life, I told his mother that I didn't kill her son. For the past 18 years and 6 months, Mr. Patello's mother has deserved for me to speak the truth. By saying that it was me who killed her son, then I'm sorry for creating the pain that is in her heart. I understand what I did. I know what I did. In spite of me serving this sentence, I've still made the efforts to grow and fix myself. Fix myself from the individual that killed Mr. Patello. I understand his mother will never forgive me.
Bobby's family was outraged. Is it fair that Bobby remains buried while his killer walks free?
Bobby was my only son, my only child. I can remember the call as if it was last night that he had been killed and stabbed, and I'll never forget that call till the day they bury me.
He was my only son, and I'll never forgive him, ever, ever, ever. I will never forgive him.
Parole has their job. The defense attorneys have their job. I understand that. But if you killed a man in cold blood, and now 20 years later, we let you back out, but you say you're not going to do it again. And do I have a guarantee on that? I don't think I do.
Both sides offered logical, sincere, and compelling arguments, making it clear that there was no easy answer. If you were on that panel, what would be your decision?
No. How are you rule? Should Anthony Rollon stay in jail for the rest of his life? Susan?
No.
No. You would forgive. Let him out. Yes, sir.
There's not enough information.
That's what I agree.
As to...
Well, you don't have the benefit of what has happened within the 18 years that he was there. There's much more information.
That wasn't really the issue in the presentation. It was when the crime was committed, when his brain was not fully developed.
But correct. But what the Supreme Court was saying is they should have the opportunity to grow and their brain develop. We don't have the benefit of the workup that was done, the sociological workup that was done, the medical workup that was done, the psychological workup that was done to know, is the person who committed that murder the same person who's sitting before us today? And is the person who's sitting before us today likely to commit another crime?
Right.
Not to mention all of the policy issues for why they went into jail. But given the fact that he was a juvenile, they have to.
Right.
The default is to a second chance, all other things being equal and falling.
So the default would be to give a second chance unless proven otherwise.
If they can, correct.
Okay. It's definitely heartbreaking to watch this case from both sides of the spectrum. The victim is forever and irreversible. Why should the perpetrator be irreversible? On the other hand, what right? Do we really have a right to kill someone just because they killed someone else? That's really lesson 2. We'll talk about the death penalty. But is it just vengeful to lock someone up for the rest of their lives? Right? These are powerful, difficult questions that we have to grapple with. And as the case developed in 2005, in the case of Roper versus Simmons, the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional to impose capital punishment on crimes committed under the age of 18. This is the development of the law. Then in 2010, in Graham versus Florida, the Supreme Court went one step further, ruling that juvenile offenders cannot be sentenced to life imprisonment for non-homicide offenses. And finally, in 2012, Miller versus Alabama, they ruled that sentences of life without parole are unconstitutional for juvenile offenders, even for murder. So that's how this whole thing developed, and it's still being developed. We are faced with the real question of what then is the point of prison. I'd like to turn it to you. Any ideas? What do you think is the point of throwing somebody in jail for the rest of their lives, for extended periods of time? What is the motivation for that? Any ideas? Yes, Joyce.
Well, first I want to address what you were talking about. Since we all live in Florida and know about Parkville, and how many people this kid murdered. And
You talking about Parkland?
Parkland, and all the different offenses that he had ahead of time. So I think that some people, under certain psychological conditions, which obviously this person has, could be locked up in a mental institution or something.
Why would you do that? What's the reason that you would lock them up? Why? You want to be
I
nasty?
think he's incorrigible. Okay, I think that there's nothing that you could do.
Why don't we just kill him?
I would do that too, but the thing is, you asked the question about jail, and that's to
Yes, Marty. Let's move it along. Marty.
Just to keep him away from society.
In other words, as a defense mechanism, we're trying to incapacitate them so that we're protecting the rest of the world. Bob.
Kind of tough for me. My brother-in-law was killed 25 years ago. Okay. And I can tell you, that individual went to jail for a period of time, and he was released. The scar has never left my family, obviously. I had no sympathy whatsoever. That individual should never be allowed into society. What about my niece, who was 12 years old at the time? What about my sister-in-law? What about their family?
So
everybody, I've heard logical discussions. What was going on?
This is from the heart now.
This is from the heart. This is all heart. That individual has to be put away.
Oh, so you're giving a very different answer to what Joyce just said, or Marty.
Yes.
It's not about incapacitation. This is about revenge.
You know what?
That's what you're saying. Retribution.
There's no. What else am I supposed to think about?
I got you loud and clear, and my heart goes out to you.
I mean, it sticks with the family forever and for the next generation.
Gotcha, Bob.
After that.
Yes, sir. One more.
The academics would probably divide it into three reasons. First, vengeance, revenge.
Vengeance, okay.
Okay? Secondly, there was a punitive idea. The person has to be punished. And historically, of course, until probably
What was the second one? The second one was what?
Punishment. Punitive.
Okay.
And historically, prisons were places of punishment. It's only been the last couple of 100 years that prison itself was punishment.
We'll get to that in just a moment.
And then thirdly, and I think everything they're talking about would come under this third idea, the rehabilitative idea.
Yes.
So
rehabilitation is what?
Is that and there is an interplay in when you read most of the criminological literature between these three factors. And rehabilitation takes into account and has the person changed? There's some psychological one.
Right.
Has the person undergone sufficient training and education?
Great points. Let me summarize it up on the screen. These are very, very nice points. And I just want to keep it rolling, just to keep the conversation a nice balance over here. I'm going to show you that there are 4 general theories of why we send someone to jail. 4 general theories, and here they are as follows. The first one, Bob, retribution. This is pure revenge.
It's not retribution.
What?
It's the wrong statement.
So which one is it?
He simply should be away.
Why?
Because he doesn't belong in society.
Why? Because he's a danger to others?
He's a dangerous person.
Oh, then you're with Marty about incapacitation. Okay, good, no problem. I misunderstood what you said. Not a problem. Does anybody believe that you should lock them up for retribution reasons? Because they deserve to be punished?
Depending on the crime.
I mean, the kid that shot 17 kids in Parkland, right? Does he deserve to be punished? I don't see that so outrageous, right? The second one is to incapacitate. This one means to protect them to protect society from them, right? As Bob was saying. A third reason that has not yet come up in our suggestions is someone said deterrence. Oh, that's what you're going to say, Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie. Deterrence is what about setting an example to everybody else, right? Listen, if you're going to do this, these are the consequences. We have to set an example. And it might break our hearts to take this remorseful Anthony Rollins, who speaks like such a mensch about how remorseful he is about killing that guy at 17 years old. But we say, listen, if we let him go, then everybody else is going to say, you'll make a good speech, you'll be able to get out. Right? Deterrence is the third reason. And what was your first name, sir? Barry. And Barry says the reason was rehabilitation, which is to actually reform the offender. You know, we call them penitentiaries. Right? Penitentiaries. Like the word for Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Penitence, right? Teshuvah. It's easier in Hebrew to say just teshuvah, which is repentance, right? That's what it is, right? Which one of these would you think is the dominant philosophy that guides the United States jail system today? Retribution. What was that, sir?
It has changed from time to time.
Okay, very good point. I'm gonna get that in just a moment. But I'm curious to know right now, what do you think is the reason why we put the people in jail today? Yes, Dean. Incapacitation to
get them off.
Keep the place safe. Right? Keep all the bad guys locked up. Right? You know, we have an amazing crowd of people here. We have a criminal defense attorney, right? That's Glenn, right? Greg, sorry. Greg. We have do we have a judge in the crowd today? Oh, is there a judge here today? I think it was supposed to be here, but didn't make it. Okay, great. So it's it's supposed to be a 40-year veteran of the police force in New York. Al Lafgar, I don't think he's here. Okay, so for centuries, as you correctly pointed out, the two of you here, there was an evolution of the reason why we send people to jail. There has been a fascinating evolution. Remember, we're trying to establish right now why we need prison reform. What's wrong with the prison system? Let's check this out. So, for centuries, the reason for jail was purely rehabilitation. That's why we call them penitentiaries. That's why we call the people that work in the penitentiaries correctional officers. And they're correctional facilities, taking people from bad to good. It's like a forced teshuvah experience. It's like a Yom Kippur all year long. Let's take a look at that on page 4 in the student textbook from Martin Pritkin from Cardozo Law Review. Punishment prisons in the Bible. Page 4 in the student textbook. When the penitentiary system in the United States began in the late 18th century, it was specifically designed for the purpose of rehabilitating the prisoner. Rehabilitation continued to be the dominant goal of the American penitentiary system for nearly 2 centuries. The views about how inmates were to be rehabilitated changed over time. We know it was about rehab, the question is how. Originally the offender was separated from his former life and made to reflect through isolation, through work, fasting, Bible study, in order to change his ways. But the results of solitary confinement and starvation diets were sorely disappointing. And as the Industrial Revolution gained steam, vocational and academic training came to replace remorse and discipline as the principal instrument for rehabilitation. This was not an abandonment of the attitude of rehabilitation as a goal, but rather a shift in approach regarding how to reach rehabilitation. By the 1960s, a growing optimism about science in general and psychiatry in particular led some to view criminal behavior as a manifestation of mental illness. That with proper supervision within the criminal justice system could be cured. still about rehab. Indeterminate sentencing was widespread, and parole boards were effectively given the role of determining when a prisoner was cured and thus fit to be released. This was effectively a medical model of criminal justice. So here you are, for centuries, the goal of the prison system was to fix the bad people. And that evolved somewhat in how they did it, but why they did it remained consistent until the 70s and 80s. Through the research of sociological scientists, particularly the most influential was sociologist Robert Martinson, who came up with his study that effectively was known as the nothing works theory. That's the nothing works theory. Bad people are just bad forever. There's nothing you can do to fix them. It's just the way that they are. Let's take a look at that. Page 5, text 1b. The medical model and the rehabilitative model in general came under increasing attack in the late 60s and 70s. Scholarly critiques of rehabilitation and corollary support for retribution abounded. And the critics were emboldened by research indicating that rehabilitation did not in fact work. Rehabilitation doesn't work. Sociologist Robert Martinson's influential 1974 paper, What Works? Questions and Answers About Prison Reform, was widely relied upon for its perceived conclusion that nothing works to reduce recidivism. And that ultimately led, in the 80s, to this most aggressive shift in the motivation behind jail, making it no longer in order to rehabilitate evil people, but merely all about retribution. Let's take a look at some of the very significant changes that were instituted in how we sentence criminals with this change in motivation. Suddenly, we were introduced to a concept of mandatory minimum sentencing. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws. It was no longer indeterminate sentencing. It was now mandatory minimums. Suddenly we were introduced to the concept that no longer could any federal prisoner have any parole. And then the very infamous law that was accepted in all 50 states except for Wisconsin, the 3 strikes law. If you've been arrested 2 times before, if one of them is a felony, no matter what the third arrest is, you're getting life in prison. As you're about to find out, a guy stole, on his third offense, he stole $153.27 of kids' videotapes. God knows why he stole them. And he got 2 life sentences. Check this out. So here we are.
America has a hefty prisoner problem on its hands. Well over 2 million individuals fill America's jails, with the cost of mass incarceration taking a huge $80+ billion bite out of the country's annual budget. How did we become the world's leading jailer, with the highest prison population rate on the planet? Things were not always this way. U.S. prisons are called penitentiaries and correctional facilities because they were originally intended as a tool to rehabilitate offenders, enabling them to regret and abandon their mistakes and to rejoin society fairly quickly. Keeping people locked up was not a goal in itself. This historically optimistic attitude took a nosedive in the early 1970s. As the rehabilitation theories guiding the criminal justice system crumbled in the face of new research. According to the latest scientific conclusions of the time, rehabilitation was ineffective and nothing could be done to prevent criminals from reoffending.
I looked at all the methods that we could find, vocational, educational, and a variety of other methods. These methods simply have no fundamental effect on the recidivism rate of people who go through those prisons, who go through the system as a whole even, probation and prison and parole and so forth.
No effect at all.
No effect, no basic effect.
Professor Robert Martinson of the City University of New York did not reach those conclusions casually. He is the first sociologist ever to do a comprehensive study of prison rehabilitation programs.
As a result, practical policy swung in favor of other punishment theories, primarily retribution and incapacitation. Keeping people behind bars for lengthy periods now became a goal of the justice system. And by 1983, every state but Wisconsin adopted mandatory minimum sentencing laws, effectively incarcerating prisoners for far longer periods. Congress joined the mandatory minimum bandwagon in 1984 with its Sentencing Reform Act and also eliminated federal parole, ensuring that federal prisoners could no longer be freed early before completing their full sentences. Many states enacted three-strike laws for repeat offenders, mandating life in prison after 3 convictions that include at least some serious or violent offenses. Take the case of a petty thief who was sentenced in California to life imprisonment after his 3rd run-in with the law.
In this case, Leandro Andrade was given not 1 but 2 sentences of 25 years to life for stealing 9 children's videotapes. The tapes were worth $153.54.
Sentences like these guarantee to fill our prisons for decades to come, with perpetrators of relatively minor crimes. We can trace the United States prison population explosion to specific dates. Between 1925 and 1972, the numbers were fairly stable. But between 1972 and the year 2000, they catapulted from 300,000 inmates to over 2 million, more than a 6-fold jump. And the rate of incarceration per 100,000 Americans more than quadrupled, from 160 to over 700. That's an awful lot of people behind bars. It's similar to locking up the entire population of the state of Kansas. This surge was fueled primarily by changing emphasis in theories of punishment. We moved from seeking ways to rehabilitate offenders to seeking ways to penalize them or simply remove them from society, in which case decades in jail certainly fits the bill. Our perspectives, however, are coming full circle. Current punitive theories are abandoning the belief in tit-for-tat prison sentences. The classic studies that have discredited rehabilitation efforts have themselves been dismissed, and fresh research holds out new hope for rehabilitative programs. Even Robert Martinson walked back his nothing works conclusion. Government policy, however, has been slow to catch on. Politicians stand little to gain from instituting real change to the justice system. The public benefits are not immediately tangible to their constituents, and they are wary of appearing to be soft on crime. Until the day we allow what we know to influence what we do, the yawning gates of our state and federal prisons will continue to swallow millions of America's masses.
This is the problem that needs to be fixed in our prisons. It's tragic as we learn how many people are suffering away in prisons when it was merely a change of motivation that caused that prison population to catapult 6 times over to over 2.3 million citizens of the United States of America that are living in prison. If our mentality was about rehabilitation, it was 17% of that. It's all because the attitude has changed. The attitude whose researchers themselves have come to admit that their own research was flawed. In this fascinating work, in Punishment Prisons in the Bible, page 723, is where, not in that book, is where Martinson himself admits. He says, listen, it was the style, it was the way that the research was conducted. Can you imagine such a blanket statement that rehabilitation is impossible? The nothing works approach to human beings? What are you dealing with machines over here? This is a human being, for heaven's sake. To think that in the 70s and 80s, this is what it was such an influential study. It changed the entire direction of this country. It's heartbreaking to think of what's going on and the travesty that's going on in the prisons when the researchers themselves admit the flaw that they've done. Yes, the law is starting to change. You may have heard of the First Act. And it's starting to be instituted, that there are starting to become changes. But what are these changes? And it's bipartisan, by the way. Obama started it and Trump is continuing it. It's bipartisan. Everybody agrees that we have to change. The question is, to what do we need to change it? Unfortunately, we know that it was wrong to discredit rehabilitation, because rehabilitation does work. We are human beings, and tragically the policy is too slow to change. So what do we change it to? Now that we know that there is a problem, okay, so how do we fix it? I'm delighted as your Chabad Rabbi to share with you what the Torah has to teach us, what our timeless wisdom, the wisdom of the Creator of the universe, has instituted, has given us in our Torah, that can help us understand jail, punishment, and the motivations for them. But just before we do that, I'd like you to take a moment to think about your child. I'd like you to think about your child and why you would punish your child. You know what the definition of grandchildren is? What did you say? It's the reason to have children? The only reason to have children. So someone once said to me, he says, grandchildren, the definition of grandchildren is the reward for not having murdered your children. Oh, yeah. So why do we punish our children? Anybody? Why do you punish your children? Dean?
To teach them.
To teach them. Very nice. Very noble. Anybody else? Why do you punish your children?
Encourage good behavior, discourage bad behavior.
Okay. Deterrence. Nice. Okay, good. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Be honest, a lot of people do it as an outlet for their own anger.
Oh, how true. We have our own flaws and we're just taking out on these poor defenseless children. You know what the Rebbe calls that? My brother is married to a woman from London. She's one of 14 siblings. In a private audience with her father many, many years ago, the Rebbe said to him that for a parent to lose his temper on his children is child abuse. Picking someone your own size, right? Isn't that interesting, right? I've got 8 children of my own, thank God. Let me tell you, I get tested. Every once in a while I get tested. I got to remember that story. Anyone else, any other reason why you would punish your own child? Your own flesh and blood? Anyone? Well, right there we got some pretty good reasons. The Torah identifies all 4 reasons that we mentioned earlier when it comes to punishments. When it comes to punishing our children or punishing criminals. And they are, the retribution, incapacitation, when somebody's throwing things and a kid's breaking everything in the house, you want to just ground them for a while to calm down, right? Deterrence and rehabilitation are some of the reasons that were mentioned. But fascinating, there is one primary reason that the Torah tells us. If you look at a book called Sefer HaChinuch, the Book of Education, it's a book written in the 13th century by a great Kabbalist as a bar mitzvah present for his son. He writes as follows. Take a look at what he says here in text number 2, page number 8. Commandment 594 is the mitzvah. This is out of 613. It's the mitzvah to give lashes to a sinner. Corporal punishment. One of the reasons for this mitzvah, why do we give lashes? Why do we punish? The Jewish people are called God's children. God therefore wished that they be punished. Why? To cause them to repent and return to Him, and thereby merit to experience the abundant good of the world to come. As the verse states, chastise your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on his destruction. It turns out that what are you trying to achieve when punishing your child? The Torah identifies that as education, as rehabilitation. And right here is where we, Jewish Americans, experience a paradigm shift in our approach to criminals. Right here. When we analyze the parent-child metaphor, we're able to suddenly reframe the context upon which we view criminals. It's easy to say, lock them up, put them away, so we never have to see them again. But when you start to think about the criminal in terms of your own flesh and blood, as your own child, you suddenly experience a paradigm shift. For example, we spoke earlier about the American system, which is the American jail system motivated by rehabilitation, right? Who are we trying to rehabilitate when we send someone to prison? Who are we trying to rehabilitate? What was that?
The inmate.
The inmate. Well, many would say that you're trying to rehabilitate society so that he or she won't be a danger to society, that he'll be a good, upstanding citizen with the rest of the world, so that he'll be able to interact like a mensch with everybody else. We try to mind our own business when it comes to telling people how to behave on their own right. But when it comes to your own child, your own flesh and blood, suddenly it's not about rehabilitating them for society, but rehabilitating them for their own sake. Right? We're doing this for their own sake. That our child should be a mensch. That the criminal himself should become a mensch. This approach, by the way, does not mean that we are soft on crime. If just because you're trying to rehabilitate them, sometimes you need to give a real patch upon him, right, in order to get the message across. It doesn't mean that you're being soft on crime. What it does mean is that your goal is different, right? And sometimes you might need to work a little harder to get that message across. This approach of looking at the criminal as a fellow human being is rehabilitating not only his body, but also his soul. And that you don't really hear about in the American law. In Talmudic and Jewish mysticism, we speak about how every one of us is made up of both a body and a soul. We're really rehabilitating not only their body, but also their soul, which has been tainted in that it was part and parcel of the crime. How do we fix their soul? Only the Creator knows how to do that. Only the user's manual, the one who created us all, knows how to do that. Take a look at text number 3, a fascinating realization from the founder of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe. He says, while the punishments of the Torah are expressed as severity, their core identity is kindness. The reason for all the punishments in the Torah is kindness. Now that's counterintuitive. All the punishments of the Torah, they sound like they're brutal, but really they're kind. Why? Because through them, the soul of the sinner achieves its rectification. It's kind of like the guys that made your Mercedes-Benz. They know what needs to happen when it makes a certain kind of noise, right? So when a soul is behaving in a certain kind of way, it's the Creator of the universe, the Creator of all of us, that gave us the user manual as to how to service the soul. That's why we give those lashes, or whatever form of punishment we're about to come across in a few minutes, to be able to realize that we are rehabilitating from a holistic approach. We're rehabilitating not only in order to maintain a functional society. We're rehabilitating because we care about our child, we care about this fellow human being, and we care about them entirely, and not only about their body, but also we care about their souls. It's a two-pronged approach. What's the logic behind it? What's the logic behind this mentality? It's beautiful. This is a beautiful piece right now. The logic behind this is that and this might be a little difficult to accept. I concede before, I'm apologizing in advance. What I'm about to share with you might be a little hard to swallow. But I'm the rabbi, I'm allowed to say this. Don't shoot the messenger. Every single human being was created in the image of God. Every single human being was created in the image of God. How do we know this? The Torah tells us, there's 4 kinds of death sentences by the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, which we don't have today, but in biblical times. They were decapitation, strangulation, burning, and hanging.
Stoning.
Yeah, stoning was one of them. Sorry, forgive me. So, what happened was that the Torah tells us that when you hang a criminal, and the other criminals that were also killed in other ways, they also get hanged. Without getting into that, it's irrelevant to our conversation right now. But when you hang a criminal, a sinner, a sinful individual, you hang him on the tree just before sunset. Because you're not allowed to leave a human being hanging on a tree overnight. So you leave them hanging, you hang them just before sunset for just a few seconds, and then you take them straight down. Why do we want to mitigate the amount of time that the sinner is hanging dead on the tree? Take a look. Page number 9. This is straight from the Bible. Deuteronomy. It says, but you shall not leave his... It's page 9, right? But you shall not leave his body on the pole overnight. Rather, you must bury him on the same day. For a hanging body is an insult to God. You shall not thereby defile your land that God gives you as an inheritance. So why is a hanging body an insult to God? What does that even mean? Right? Rashi explains on page 10. It is a degradation of the king, of God, because man is made in the likeness of God's image. And the people of Israel are his children. This can be compared to identical twin brothers, one of whom became a king, while the other one became an outlaw and was hanged. Whoever would see the outlaw hanging would say, the king is hanging. We human beings who are created in the image of our God, when we're hanging, that is a disgrace to God. Now, we're not talking here about saints or rabbis or cantors. We're talking about the dregs of society. We're talking here about a guy that wasn't just suspected of a crime, but actually convicted of a crime. And as we'll learn in lesson 2, to get convicted of a crime in Jewish law, a death penalty, you really, really have to have a death wish. We'll learn about that in lesson 2. This guy or woman was sentenced to death, and it is that person, this evil sinner, this Nicholas Cruz, this Sandy Hook shooter, or some other awful human being that we're saying about them. The Torah tells us about them. I didn't make this up. They are in the image of God. And you cannot let them be disgraced. I just want to add one point to this. Even in American law, we find that the law is kind to criminals, which is the principle of forbidding cruel and unusual punishment. And also in Torah law, we find another very interesting perspective, which is, when you get 2 punishments, like lashes and death sentence, right? There's a principle in Talmud called kamle b'derabba minei, which means you don't first give the guy lashes and then you kill him, right? You go for the more severe punishment instead of both, right? And like your bank, when they give you what do they call it, an overdraft, they take the biggest check first, right? So you overdraft everything, right? But this way, the Torah says that you give them the bigger punishment only. Why? Because of the principle of ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, and you shall treat your brother as yourself. Right? So once again, the Torah is telling us to treat a convicted criminal, an evil person, with love like you would treat yourself. Yes, sir?
I think there's another aspect of this concept, for example, of leaving a body hanging. It's respecting ourselves, too. In addition to the respect of God, this person's made in God's image. What is the purpose for us to see a body hanging?
Wouldn't there be a deterrent factor? Wouldn't that be a great deterrent? Leave them there for weeks, you'd see deterrents, right?
For what? The people who have seen the hanging, the deterrent effect has occurred.
Yeah, but don't they do that in Arab countries? They leave them hanging there for as long as they can?
What makes us say that that's the correct thing to do? I mean, we're talking about, Judaism, and we're talking about U.S. law in this course. And it's sadistic, in essence, to have a body hanging there and to have it deteriorate over the course of a period of time. So I think it's abusive to us. It's obviously it's abusive.
So what was your first name again?
Michael.
Michael. So Michael, when you say it's abusive to us, I agree with you, because we and the criminal are one and the same. We recognize the humanity, the brotherhood, the kinship that we share with this terrible human being, right? Which comes to reframe the Jewish approach to punishment, and ultimately, as we'll see in a few moments, to jail as well. Because what's happening here is that whereas American law tragically has evolved to the point of where the motivating factor, the main motivating factor for jailing people is retribution, is revenge and punishment, in Jewish law it's not that at all. It's all about recognizing the fellow human being, the godly soul, which is trapped and stuck inside of this evil human being, which we are trying and hoping to rehabilitate. And that's the reason that, we'll find out soon, Jewish law has a very, very different approach to jail, a very radical approach to jail, which I'm excited to share that with you in just a moment. So let's take a look. Let's step inside the jail for a minute. So what is life really like inside the jails? We're about to hear from two criminology professors and from Bernie Kerik. You know what Bernie Kerik is? Bernie was on my radio show a few weeks ago. He was the former police chief of New York City. He was also the commissioner of the New York jails. And he was most famous for 9/11 when he was, out there. But he also got to see the jails from the inside. He spent like a couple years, about 3 years I think it was, on the inside of the jails. These criminology professors also are going to share with us their perspectives. One is purely from a criminology approach, and the other one was also a inside the jails. These next few texts are users' manuals for people that are sent to jail, that are going to jail. It's basically a what to expect survival guide for people going to jail. Let's take a look at what it's really like in there. On page 11. The education programs are also inadequate. We're actually running out of time, so I'm just going to summarize this a little bit right now. I'm just going to summarize text number 5. Text number 5 brings up 3 or 4 points over here, which is what's going on in jails. First thing they say is that there's almost no post-secondary education. Post-secondary school education is almost non-existent. Unfortunately, very little resources, staff, and space are devoted to so-called inmate education, right? Also, they say over here that college courses are few and far between. Not only are they few and far between, but also the colleges they can easily pull it, and you can read it in the text, they can easily pull it when they lose patience with the bureaucrats who manage the penitentiary, right? Besides, the prison administrators who are really in charge of all of the curriculum, they are actually, don't support higher education, because they see outside university instructors as potentially subversive threats to the security and the smooth running of the institution. The wardens are actually intimidated by educated prisoners, because they know that they have this educated convicts are a threat to authority. They can tell them that that's against my rights, that's against the law. Convict students are also dangerous. They're regarded as dangerous because they use the mail and phones to contact the outside world. So this is actually uneducated. It's actually discouraged education in the jails. He says that they're jailers, they're not educators. There's something called, of course, the Pell Grant, which helps people with college education, and it used to be a big problem getting the inmates to be able to apply for Pell Grants. Today it's not a problem at all, because they can't get it. The Pell Grants don't apply to inmates whatsoever. It was actually Betsy DeVos, the new education minister under President Trump. She said about Pell Grants that when she visited her prison education program a few months after she took office, she said that reinstating Pell Grants for inmates was a very good and interesting possibility. Okay, now, the text continues here in text number 6. They say how the penitentiaries are run by gangs. And the violence there is endemic. And you can't just stay away from the gangs, because if you do, then they'll just completely run you over. You know, the way it works tragically with the gangs is tragic. You know, where if you don't defend yourself, then they continue to push the envelope, and you have to align with a gang, which perpetuates a cycle of violence. You get into trouble, and you tragically aren't able to experience good behavior. And the way Bernie Carrick writes about in text number 7, also heartbreaking. He speaks about the collateral forms of punishment in text number 7 that are designed to break a man's spirit and institutionalize him. He speaks about the culture amongst certain correction staff where it is acceptable to inflict as much punishment as on the inmates as the staff can get away with. It's not physical, it's more psychological, where they say to them, you're worth less than this to me, and they try to break them. They try to dehumanize. That's the key here. They try to dehumanize the inmates. What this all leads us to understand is that the culture today in the prisons is certainly not, it is absolutely 2 thumbs down. It is absolutely not conducive in any way whatsoever to rehabilitation. And we see clearly the numbers speak for themselves. It's not working. You'll see in text number 8, the numbers are frightening. From the U.S. National Institute of Justice, recidivism, it speaks of Bureau of Justice Statistics found high rates of recidivism amongst released prisoners. One study tracking 404,000 prisoners in 30 states found that within 3 years of release, 2/3 of the released prisoners were rearrested, and within 5 years, 3 out of 4 released prisoners are back in jail. If that doesn't break your hearts. Well, we're certainly not encouraging them to rehabilitate, because they're actually getting worse in jail. That's where they're learning really how to behave badly, and they're getting really bad friendships over there. Prisons are not being operated as the Torah would have prescribed moments ago. B'tselem Elokim bara et ha'adam, in the image of God was man created. It's that lack of dignity. It's that lack of dignity that is breaking the spirit of the prisoners and not allowing them, not inspiring them to rehabilitate themselves. Here it is. These are some of the problems in the jails here. They're being dehumanized. And let's hear from the Rebbe. Speech over here. He was speaking to a group of prison inmates. They were brought to 770 Eastern Parkway, to the Lubavitch World Headquarters. And look at the beautiful dignity with which the Rebbe speaks to these inmates. He's speaking to them it's really a farbrengen. There's thousands of people there. But the inmates are there too. Many of them, I think all of them were actually Jewish. But the Rebbe is speaking in Yiddish. The subtitles are on the bottom of the screen, all right? Watch this.
Torah, der Zweck von halten am Menschen in Beis Asuri ist nicht, dass der Linie von Einisch, nur geben ihm eine Gelegenheit, soll sich missbeinen sein. In die Unionen, was getan, bildlich zu ihm. Wo der Vater hat nem reingesetzt bei Beis Asuri, mit Gitte mechet Möglichkeit, soll sich lernen, gestalten sein, V'chula soll sich können zugereden, zu Areis gehen und non im Leben achayim, beseder, und bescholem, und bejesher, durch die Achone, was wird haben, bemerkt von den Tagen, was gefindet hat, in den Beis Asuri. Wo dazu darf man haben, zum allen Menschen, soll haben bei sich ein Gefühl, als ist bis allmählich muss sein. Als ist ein Mensch, was eben nur wird wollen, ist demut Odom, Miloschen, Dameler, in der Welt bis allmählich muss sein. Beschaß man nimmt ihm zu die Möglichkeiten und man drückt ihm zu, man quetscht ihm zu und man lässt ihm nicht aufheben den Kopf, ist nicht nur der Beisa Asur im 4. Test dem Tachlis, aber macht von einem Apeshea noch mehr, wie gewähnt Beschaß, als hinterreingegangen. Wo der Pfarrer Mima Torres von der Beisa Asurim, aber die Jiden, was gefunden sich dort, weil der sagt, der Nicht-Jiden, weil der geht zu Sheva Mitzvahs, Bnei Neach, le-Reime Mesrucham, le-Ede Desrucham. Als in die Unionen, was eine nicht gemuchrochen, seine sie Punkt, wie hat die, was gefunden sich Bechelus, Punkt hat die, was sie seine Schemri von Beis Asuri.
Isn't that beautiful that everyone was talking to both Jewish and non-Jewish prisoners, if you were able to follow the subtitle? He was saying, you're a gift to this world. You're so unique. You are in the image of God. You have a mission in this world. And the Rebbe was breathing a positive, uplifting message to these broken souls. They were brought to 770. Can you imagine the lack of dignity? You know, the Rebbe didn't want to start the Farbrengen because they were all sitting together. And it was very obvious that the prisoners, these are the prisoners, those guys over there. The Rebbe didn't want to come out until they scattered them throughout the room. So nobody would know where they were. What a beautiful, inspirational, subliminal message. I don't want you to be degraded. I don't want to break your spirit. I want to breathe life into you. I want to inspire you and tell you how much good that you can bring to this world. You are not a mistake. You were created for a purpose. And that, so beautiful, is the Rebbe's explanation on what we should be doing in prison, which is about thinking about how you can utilize your unique talents and gifts in order to make this world a better place through your unique talents. But I want to share with you this. You know, we've compared the American system and the Torah system, right? The American system used to be rehabilitation, which was fantastic, and then it became this retribution through the flawed scientific research, sociology. Torah is all about rehabilitating. We believe, I don't know what original sin is, but I know that we don't believe in it. We believe that everybody's originally good. Your default setting is holy. And any sin that you do is a violation of who you truly are. That's why the word for teshuvah on Yom Kippur, repent, we translate it as repentance. What does repentance mean? Anybody know? What does repentance mean? No, repentance means I'm going from bad, I'm bad, and I'm becoming good. I'm changing, exactly. Repentance means I'm changing. Right now I'm not good, and I'm becoming good. That's not the translation of the word teshuvah. Teshuvah means to return, like you said, Tom. It means coming back. Back to where? Where am I coming back to? Coming back to my natural, original, unbreakable goodness. That's what teshuvah means. And that's what the Rebbe was talking about here. He was saying, we're all good, even the criminals. They're good people. And I know this is hard to accept, especially when you hear from someone like Bob in the back. It's very painful. But at least an attitude, at least a perspective is extremely powerful. I want to take this one step further. Steve. Yes.
There's another viewpoint which should be considered. Hashem made all of us. Hashem made all of us to be here for a reason. You are assuming that that's all good reasons. That we are all good reasons.
You think some of us are here for it to be the bad guys?
Yeah. As a matter of fact,
Ouch.
I do. I do believe that Hashem sets the table and gives us the ability to take from the table or not take from the table. And that I'm just saying, isn't it possible that Hashem makes people to serve as a...
You know, Steve, a fascinating point. I just want to repeat in case you didn't hear. In case you didn't hear, I'm going to repeat what he said. he said, maybe everybody has a mission. Granted, okay, everybody's put in this world by God, image of God. You put here for a reason. But how do you know that reason is a good reason? Maybe you're here to be just a nudnik. Maybe you're here to be a shlemazel, right? How do you know that you're here to do good? In subsequent lessons of this course, like in the course about the death penalty, next class, we'll learn about certain people that just fartik, like we say in Yiddish. It's all over. The game's over. Right? So there is such a degree. Right now we're talking about the prison category, okay? I want to take it one step further and say the following. The Torah's approach to jail is even more radical than what we've said so far in terms of its attitude of being rehabilitative to an extreme. The Torah rejects the entire notion of prison altogether. Now, we do have a concept of holding cells. There is such a thing. It's mentioned sporadically throughout the Torah that they locked the guy up because they didn't know what to do with him yet. So yeah, there is such a thing as incapacitating a guy until we work out what to do. But to sentence a human being, the image of God, to be locked in a cage like a vegetable. You know what the difference between a vegetable and an animal is? The animal kingdom is free to roam. It's alive, but it roams. The vegetable kingdom is alive, but it's rooted to the spot. To take a human being and to tie him to a tree, to chain him to a tree or to a cell, is something that the Torah absolutely rejects. We do have temporary, but not as a punishment, just until we work it out. But what is the reason that the Torah, there's no such thing in the Torah as sentencing someone to jail? You either give the guy lashes, give him a fine, or a very fascinating alternative. We'll talk about that right after this. But let's understand why. Why is the Torah so much against jail? Because a human being was created for a purpose in this world. For us to lock up that human being, every single human being, and this is where I will disagree with you, Steve, with every single human being has a unique gift to bring to this world. There's actually a piece of real estate which only you can illuminate in this world. The house that you are drawn towards, the real estate that you're drawn to buy or drawn away from, is because your soul is sensing, Kabbalistically, subliminally, a soul connection to a certain piece of real estate. And why do we all live in Palm Beach Gardens? Why did we move to Palm Beach Gardens and not to Palm Springs? Seriously. What's wrong with Palm Springs? What's wrong with San Diego? Why not Phoenix, Arizona? Our souls collectively had a connection to this part of the world. But if you take a guy and you lock him up in some facility forever, you are denying them the ability to fulfill the purpose for which they were placed into this world. Let's hear this in the Rebbe's own words.
Was in der Linie von Bria so Orden bis Almeino Kid Museno, sagt auf drauf im Posik Orden Lomol Yvol, Ani Nivreisi Leshamisches Keini. A Mensch ist beschaffen geworden nicht auf sein heilig Bottel, nur ist beschaffen geworden auf Ufta. Und nur Ufton in der Nefen, was ist sein Leshamisches Keini, Ufton in Tev, in Gdusha, in Ruchnis, Vechulu. Als sitzt in Beis Asurim, was tut sich auf, man nimmt ihm zu der Möglichkeit, soll etwas tun. Wir sollen halten in Elam Azeh. Und Teres Chesed soll sagen, ich setze mal rein in Beis Asurim. Nimmt ihm zu der Möglichkeit von Mekayim sein, Odom, Lommel Yivoli, dass Hepech Chesed und non kennt Jeles. Wo der Pfarrer segnet auch Nation von ein Tachas ein Kipschute. Ja Tachas ja Kipschute. Was bei Ami Horetz, bei der Größte von sie, bei der Beste von sie, Bishas Maten Teri, das gewähren ab Dover Horogi, als ja Tachas ja, das gewähren Kipschute. Wie man hat in See Redinim, als Agane, was gegangen wird, bei Jod ist, hat demut auf sein Jod zugenommen beim Jahr. Sie kann aber nicht sein, dass in Teras Chesed, dämmelt können nicht an dem Lommel gewollt, kommt an mehr nicht wie mit ein Hand, mehr nicht wie mit ein Nei, mehr nicht wie mit ein Schein, oder ein Schein, was fällt. Sie kann sein, als nicht, wo der Stadt nicht so unter die anhogt. Zum Male sein unter die Schlich.
We were placed into this world with exactly the right resources that we need to fulfill our unique mission in this world. By the way, this explains a little bit Kabbalistically about the rich and the poor and those that were created with more human functionality and less human functionality. Certain souls have unique missions, custom missions, that they don't need so much resources or they need much more resources. Some of us, really need $151 billion, to get our missions done, right? Mr. Amazon, right? So we have just the right amount of hands and fingers and toes and body parts and time. We have exactly the right amount of time to fulfill our purpose in this world. You're going to take a guy and lock him up in jail for the rest of his life? 40 years? How's he going to fulfill his mission? Let's look at this in the Rebbe's words here on page 17. It's beautifully expressed. Page 17. Man was created in the divine image and was born to toil and to serve his Creator. Man was not created to be idle, but to work and achieve positive things to serve his Creator in holy and spiritual pursuits. When a person is in prison, they are denied the ability to do anything. Placing a living person in a prison and denying them the ability to fulfill their life mission of man was born to toil is contrary to the Torah of kindness. This is cruel and does not benefit anyone. The Rebbe goes on to explain that ours is a Torah of kindness. We don't chop hands off. Eye for an eye does not mean literally. It means eye for a fine. It means tooth for a fine. It means wound for a fine. It's not literally eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's money compensation, right? Because if you take away the guy's tooth or his arm or his leg or his eye, they're not going to be able to adequately fulfill their mission in this world. And all this is based on this extraordinary Weltanschauung, this approach of this incredibly compassionate approach of the Torah, which is viewing every single human being as being created in the image of God. Jail is the antithesis of who we are. Born to toil, born to serve my Creator. When I'm incarcerated, I can neither toil nor can I serve my Creator. So what then? Very nice. So the Torah tells us what not to do. Okay, very nice. We don't do jail, right? So what does the Torah tell us to do? The Torah categorically rejects jail. So what do we do? What is the Torah's solution? Fascinating. The Torah speaks of an Ir Miklat, which is a city of refuge, a sanctuary city. The original sanctuary city, biblically. What a sanctuary city is that an inadvertent murderer was allowed to run away to find refuge in the sanctuary city. This was a city where he was allowed to live without ever leaving its borders. So he was an honor system. Because if you left, if the criminal would leave the sanctuary city, then the victim's relatives would be allowed to kill him. Inside the sanctuary city, they were not allowed to be touched. Let me just finish the explanation. Inside the sanctuary city, they were not allowed to be touched. Once they set foot outside the sanctuary city, your blood is on your own head. So therefore it's an honor system. You want to take a chance? Knock yourself out, right? But inside the sanctuary city, they were free to live, free to roam, free to work. And you know who lived in the sanctuary city? These were cities of the Levites, the Kohanim family. It had to be a majority of Levites. If there was ever a majority of criminals in the city, it was forfeited its status as a sanctuary city. You had to have a majority of role models, of positive mentors that were living there to be able to facilitate the rehabilitation of the criminals. And one last point I want to share with you about this sanctuary city is that the Talmud goes so far so as to tell us that if the residents of the sanctuary city decided that they wanted to honor a criminal for, community service, maybe he was the Rabbi of the shul, maybe he was a philanthropist, I don't know. If they wanted to honor a criminal in the sanctuary city, then it was an obligation of the criminal to let them know that he is a criminal and why he lives there. Which shows us that the Torah defends the dignity of the criminals in the sanctuary city. They never lost their dignity. Nobody knows why they moved in. Oh, you moved into town. You moved into Palm Beach Gardens. Very nice. Come join us in shul. We don't know why you moved here. He doesn't carry a big red sign on the top of his head saying, I'm a criminal. I'm a felon. Their dignity was protected. That's how you're able to maintain both. On the one hand, you're able to facilitate rehabilitation, where there is certainly consequences for the crime, but at the same time, you're doing so in a positive environment, not by dehumanizing them, not by robbing them of an education, or by forcing them into gang violence, or by treating them like garbage. No, putting them with all the rabbis. You're going to have to move into the shul for the next 12 years of your life, right? You have to live inside of the Chabad house, right? Where all the rabbis are hanging out. And maybe you'll come out a reformed person. How's that for a rehabilitative process?
This wasn't just a self-imposed quote-unquote prison going to one of the three cities. If you were tried and it was determined that it was not a premeditated murder, you would be sentenced and sent to one of those cities, as I recall from the recent parsha.
Okay, fine. So hang on. So you were sentenced there, correct? But before the trial, you want to get there as soon as possible. That is, when we were kids, I don't know if they do it today. When you're playing with your friends, you have a den. I don't know. In South Africa, we called it a den. When you touch something, that's your safe space. You're not allowed to be touched, right? So this was the den. This is where you were safe. Nobody was allowed to touch you. Before the court case, you wanted to make sure you were there because there nobody could touch you.
Did this only apply to murder? Did it also apply to that?
It did. It did only apply to inadvertent murder, but we are using it tonight as a case study to explain to us the rehabilitative environment that the Torah sets in motion, which is not a dehumanizing jail. Somebody on the radio the other day, somebody called into our radio show and said that 2 nights in the Palm Beach County jail are enough to inspire the fear of God into any decent human being, because it is so incredibly awful of an experience. Yes, sir, you were going to say something?
Yeah. One point is that the Torah seems to make a very sort of nuanced approach to this idea of rehabilitative sentencing, because we have some levels of crime, i.e. inadvertent crime, like what we would in modern times call manslaughter typically,
right?
That can be rehabilitated, whereas more premeditated. The Torah does not look at what we would now call murder one and say, this guy can be rehabilitated. We'd say, okay, if he was caught with witnesses, etc., and he was warned, all the prerequisites.
So we'll talk about that next week. Next week we'll talk about the ones that can't be rehabilitated. That's the death sentence.
But the point is, though, is that there is, it's not, the Torah very clearly does not seem to say that everybody can be fixed, that there's some people that are just playing over the line, and some people that they made a mistake and it wasn't.
Agreed. Today we're not talking about the exception. We're not talking about the exception today. Today we're just introducing the topic.
But the word murder, though, usually has the connotation, at least, of being a deliberate, knowing action, as opposed to manslaughter, which is an unintentional killing.
Okay. Fine. So yes, there are classifications, but today we're just trying to establish a foundation, a frame of reference, something to be able to help us understand what is the Torah's approach to this incredibly broken system, which is what's going on right now with our state of Kansas, right? Arlene, yes?
I just think it's important to somehow factor in all of this, that I know in the jail system, I'm assuming prisons as well, there's a disproportionate and incredibly high number, I can't think of the percentage, of people with mental illness. So, very often now what has happened, and when you talk about rehabilitation,
yeah,
they're loaded with people that maybe can't access
They need medical help.
They absolutely. And
Yeah.
That's not part of
You can't just release those guys out into society. That's
And just reflecting on what they have done or some introspection is not going to do it. They really need
Yeah, Arlene, you raise a very interesting point because, especially when it comes to something like pedophilia, right? A very frightening rate of recidivism over there is that, according to DSM, which is the manual of various syndromes. That's what I was going to say. Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It speaks about how pedophilia is a mental illness, and it's really not something that you can really rehabilitate. And that's, like you were saying, sir, is more of an exception, which we're going to have to deal with. It's a much bigger problem. Yes, Lynn. Yes. Lynn.
The largest mental health facility in the state of Florida is the Dade County Jail.
Mental health, right? Oh, the largest mental health facility in the state of Florida. Wow, is the Dade County Jail.
They closed all the mental health.
Very, very interesting. Very sad. Sad. Yes, Richard.
I've heard no mention at all tonight of corporal punishment. Does that enter into this discussion at all?
It's interesting. Corporal punishment, which would be something like lashes. Yeah, we're going to get there in just a moment. Let me get to that in just a moment, okay? So I just want to say this. This concept of the sanctuary city is so cool that the deputy president of the Israeli Supreme Court, Justice Menachem Elon, proposed reforming the Israeli jail system into such a concept. And I'll tell you this, that in upstate New York, I forget what it's called, Ossining, I'm not sure exactly what the jail is called, Otisville. The Jewish jail, it's like a camp. There's no fences, there's no guards. You just sort of, it's a bit of an honor system, you do your time, and it's nothing like a federal prison. It's just like a camp, where you don't have to...
That's not for murders.
Of course not, but there is such a concept, right? It's a nice thing where we're doing that. So it's just interesting in the consciousness of prison reform. This is certainly part of the conversation. Yes, sir.
The whole idea of a sanctuary city is really a way for society to take into account degrees of culpability. And what it's saying is, although somebody did something wrong, there's a degree of culpability that is not so high as to lock them up or to otherwise punish them. And we have that same concept in today's criminal law, whether you call it suspended sentences or parole. It hasn't disappeared, it just manifests itself differently.
Yes. So again, with the motivation behind the jail system.
Well, the idea that you're trying to decide, I think we all recognize that if the starving man steals a loaf of bread, he's less culpable than the rich man who steals another couple $1 million.
Right. So it's all about the context, right? And when you put things like the 3 strikes law, you're going in a different direction entirely.
Well, you have other complexities there too, because of how they define the offenses that qualify as strikes 1 and 2.
Right.
And with the fact that so many minor offenses have actually over the years become elevated, it has really made the 3 strikes law worse, because there are things that would have been low-grade felonies.
Right, like crack cocaine, for example, which suddenly became very much more serious than powder cocaine. But let me try to wrap this up. Try to pull everything together here as we close our arguments here. So about some conclusions and some practical suggestions. I'm hoping that it's clear this incredibly humane approach that Torah has to crime, to criminals. We all make mistakes. Whether we should be given a second chance, we'll be talking about that in lesson 5 in rehabilitation. But the perspective of looking at a criminal as one would look at your own flesh and blood. This is a piece of God. Like I am a piece of God. It's a human being. It's a soul, a godly soul inside of a body. It's created in the image of God. The Rahmanis that we're able to think about is one that really changes the game over here. But so on a practical level, to talk about some practical suggestions, what the Torah would propose here is like this. For starters, we would speak about less aggressive sentencing. That we should really be using prisons less. If the Torah was able to influence prison reform right now, we'd be having a lot less aggressive sentencing. For example, we'd have more fines, more restitution, more community service, more house arrest. And like you suggested, Richard, you know what? Maybe lashes is not such a terrible thing. Think about it. Lashes. Would you rather spend 10 years in prison or get lashes that are going to put the fear of God in you? Think about it. Would you rather give your son a patch in panim, which is really not very nice, or not talk to him for 5 years? You know what I'm saying? Maybe there's some wisdom there, and I have to tell you, it's being proposed in the judicial system, this concept of reintroducing something like lashes. Why? We think it's so primitive, it's so inhumane? Maybe not. Maybe we have to take a double take on that, because sending them to prison for the next 25 years is not only costing all the taxpayers, but it's actually making the criminals worse. Second, another practical suggestion is to bring more education to criminals by reintroducing the Pell Grant, rehab programs, bringing in college into the prisons. And for the wardens, how about if we gave the wardens, prison wardens, some psychological training, a little bit of motivational guidance, give them a little positive energy. And what about a little pay raise? For the prison wardens, give them a little more self-respect. And you know what the Rebbe says? Some more. Yes, Joyce?
What about getting rid of all the private prisons?
Interesting. That's a business. That's a big business, the private prisons. That's a huge business and lobbyists and all sorts of things. Very interesting point you raised there, right? But you know what the Rebbe says? He says, why are we afraid to introduce God into our prisons? What would happen if they had a little more religion in the prison, a little bit more ability to study, accountability, responsibility? Do you know that these JLI courses are being taught in the prisons of upstate New York? Can you imagine a prisoner learning about this stuff? Right? How inspiring would that be to them? We're all able to reinvent ourselves. And finally, one last point is, how about a little bit more reward, more incentivizing of good behavior? When we go back to our friend at the beginning of this class, Anthony Rollins, who was the juvenile, killed that other guy, the drug dealer at 17 years old. You know what? If he's truly showing good behavior, if he's truly showing, if there's character witnesses in the jail about he's becoming a mensch, why not? Why not give the guy a second chance? Why can't we incentivize him to really make a difference? To aspire towards coming out. And on a very practical level, this is more on the level of law. But for us as private individuals, you know what we can do? Just a few suggestions. For starters, we can change our way of thinking. We can just experience this paradigm shift and see them as humans too. Me as a rabbi, when I reach out to prisoners, sometimes I get them, and I get a lot of letters from jail, by the way, especially from the South Bay facility here, because they hear me on the radio every Sunday morning. We do the Sunday Shmooze radio show. And for these Jewish prisoners, it's the only connection to Judaism. They write me a lot of letters. And people tell me, why are you even connecting to these prisoners? Why do you need to care about these dregs of society? And I say to them, they are our fellow human beings. They're our brothers and sisters, whether you choose to admit it or not. So the first things we can do is change our attitude. There's a Chabad institution inspired by the Rebbe called Aleph. You ever heard of Aleph? Aleph is the Chabad outreach to prisoners and members of the armed forces. Not very popular in terms of a charity, supporting the prisoners. But you know what? There are a lot of prisoners out there that are wrongfully convicted and that need our help and that they need our dignity. What they do is that they reach out to these prisoners, especially the Jewish prisoners. They study Torah with them. They do a yeshivacation, and it's all around the country. Aleph is working with us here at the Chabad of Palm Beach Gardens. We are actively seeking volunteers right now. If you're able to join us, please let me know. On Fridays, we are seeking volunteers that can go to the prisons and they can spend one Friday a month for an hour or two speaking to the prisoners, maybe sharing with them some Torah wisdom, maybe studying something with them, bringing them some tefillin, bringing them some Shabbos candles, being able to show them a face that's not a gang inside of the prison. You know, there's even a pen pal program that Aleph has. Aleph has a pen pal program. You can just write to a prisoner. Can you imagine? Let them know what's going on in the outside world. Let them know about the hope that they can aspire towards. And we also, as private individuals, can even mentor released prisoners. You know, they have a very hard time integrating back into society. We'll talk about that in lesson 5. You know, when we speak about getting a job, what it's like for a prisoner to get a job, and what rights the employers have in finding out and publicizing the criminal history of their prospective employees, right? So it's very, very degrading and very challenging, and sometimes rightfully so, for them to be able to find a job. How about if you serve as a mentor, give them a little guidance, right? And especially, you know who suffers the most? Is their families. Their children. Imagine a child who sees his father taken away in handcuffs. Guilty or not, doesn't matter. That kid is scarred for the rest of his life. Right? Growing up without a mentor, growing up without a role model, growing up with that stigma, with that lack of dignity is traumatic. Imagine if you invite them over, the family, for Shabbos dinner. What did they do wrong? Just because a member of the family, the father, the mother, committed a crime, the rest of the family has to live with that stigma? You can invite them over for Shabbos. Give them a ride somewhere. Can you imagine the loss of income that they must be experiencing? Just show them that you care. When this guy called into the radio, that Sunday a week ago, we opened the lines. We asked for people to tell us what it's like inside the prisons. Greg, this was the week after you were on the show. We asked, you know, what's it like in the prisons? A guy calls up, says, I've been behind bars for 18 years and 6 months. I said, how long are you out? He says, 6 years. I said to him, how did you do it? You've defied the statistic. According to the statistic, within 5 years, 75% of released criminals are back in jail. Why is it that you're still out? To what you accredit it? He said, hope. I saw my granddaughter. She loves me. I love her. And I want to be there for her. It's that hope that's able to bring out that Tselem Elokim, the image of God which is inherent inside each and every single one of us. We can make that difference merely by the way that we look, talk, or interact with these poor prisoners. Let's just summarize this with a quick key points here.
Crime and consequence. Lesson 1. Lock and key. 1. There are 4 major theories of punishment in legal thought: retribution, incapacitation, deterrence, and rehabilitation. 2. Historically, in the American legal system, the emphasis was on rehabilitation. But this changed in the 1970s, and retribution and incapacitation became the dominant goals of punishment. This shift in emphasis fueled an explosion in the number of people being incarcerated. 3. The Torah's primary theory of punishment is rehabilitation of the sinner for their own sake. Even the worst criminals were created in God's image and are therefore worthy of our help to rehabilitate themselves. 4. The reality of the contemporary prison system is that educational opportunities are woefully inadequate, violence is endemic, and prisoners are subjected to dehumanization and abuse. 5. The Bible does not prescribe an incarceration system because it maintains that every human being has a God-given mission in life and requires freedom in order to pursue it. 6. Jewish law tolerates prisons only when absolutely necessary to protect society. 7. On the policy level, the Torah teaches us that A. Prisons should be used much less, only when absolutely necessary, B. The prison system must be completely overhauled, protecting the dignity of prisoners and focusing on rehabilitation. And C. Convicted criminals should be granted second chances if they are no longer a threat to society. 8. Criminals are human beings, deserving our concern, respect, and assistance. The families of the incarcerated also suffer greatly and are in need of our help. Next week, where does Judaism stand on the death penalty? Are some people so evil that they deserve to be executed? Is even the slight chance of executing an innocent person a risk too great to afford? If you think you already know where Judaism stands on this perennial topic of debate, next week's lesson will surprise you.
So this will conclude the lesson 1 tonight. I want to thank you all for joining us here tonight for this fascinating conversation. Please feel free to come on over and share your thoughts and questions. If you'd like to send me an email, it's rabbi@jewishgardens.com. That's rabbi@jewishgardens.com. And would love to hear your thoughts, your feedback, and your reflections, as well as your questions or disagreements. If nothing else, to get you thinking, that would be the point of tonight's discussion. Thank you very, very much.